few questions quickly so we can open the space to the audience for questions, which I'm sure they have. Mark, this is based on, I remember you talking to me about it, to Marcel Maus's text on techniques of the body, written in 1934. Can you walk us through the intellectual process a little bit, coming upon the text, and how did you make the connection, starting and getting to where you've gotten today?
Well, it's a bit of a mystery to me. The immediate starting point was Stelios actually allowing us to do this for you, and I want to thank you for that, because it's not something I'd ever done before or even thought about doing. So having agreed that we would make a film, and we started exchanging ideas, we exchanged visual ideas first, I think it would be fair to say. Constanine can talk about what he was doing. He was showing me some of the footage that he'd been shooting. I had in mind some visual material. And then two other things came into play. I had always been struck by the Manes Kaliniktias, the song by Douglas in the middle of the film. For me, it was an immensely powerful song, and I'd always been wanting to find some way to use that in something, and it seemed right in this. And the other thing was, I'll speak for myself, to want to make a film about the refugee situation now that wasn't just about the refugee situation now, and in particular wasn't refugee, 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 but how to think about this. And actually I was looking over some of the footage with my 7-year-old daughter, and I said, what do you think about these people? Don't they look poor to you? And she said, the only ones who really look any different to anybody else to me are the ones lying on the ground. And for her, the categorical difference was, were you lying on the ground or were you standing up? It was about the body. And that got me into the Maus text, which is a very remarkable, a kind of pioneering sketch of ideas by this eminent sociologist in 1934, which is that you might think about what unites people in terms of their physical movements. And then the question was, well, if you thought about what unites and what divides people on the basis of their physical movements, then how visually could you explore that idea? So, sorry, that's a long answer.
Constanine, how do we get from Maus's text to what we saw today from a filmmaker's point of view? And how did you work with Mark on this? And of course, you're combining archival material with your own footage. You went out there, you took a lot of new images, you took photographs, so you combined, you brought everything together. So how did that work? Having, again, Maus's text in mind.
The phone call from Mark last Christmas, New Year, and I was down at my mother's house in the south of the Peloponnese, and Mark phones and he goes, I want to do a film about this, but I'm not quite sure how it's going to go, no? Mm-hmm. And I go, yes, it's very interesting, because I'm not quite sure what it's about. But it was a liberating phone call in the sense that I'd been going to Platia Victorias since last summer and photographing. I'm editing another film, but in the evenings, during the day when I had off, I'd be going down and photographing. And so I had this enormous, very discreetly, it's all with iPhone, trying not to use big cameras and stuff and big technology, very discreet. I quite loathe the idea of me as the photographer in a context, and so and so Mark's proposal was incredibly liberating. I think for a long time we didn't both know where we were going. He gave me Maus's text, which I read, La Technique du Corps. It was incredibly kind of radical for something written in the 1930s, still is. And it seemed to be the key to get away from the stereotypic approach to a humanitarian or a refugee crisis or whatever, because that's okay. I mean, the media can do that, television can do that, the most sensationalist documentary can do that, but obviously I think we wanted to do more of a meditation on these questions. So in a way, it was very liberating, Mark's proposal and using that text. And it seemed to fit in very well with what the material was, because it was really about just looking at people very discreetly and how they moved, how they walked, how they talked on the mobile phone, how they used their iPad, how they were sitting in Platea Victoria. And maybe the great goddess of Platea Victoria was actually called Wi-Fi, because that's why people were going to Platea Victoria, because there was free Wi-Fi from the local council and they could plan the next leg of the journey to Germany or wherever. So it was kind of a very fortuitous moment, I think. No? It was good.
Now, when you read Mauss's text, he makes the argument that bodily movement, even the most mundane one, is a cultural technique, really. And the form of it changes either historically or culturally. When you started looking at people, refugees, through that perspective, through that lens, what did you see? Is that true? Does that work? That even the most mundane of movement is something that is codified in many ways? It's like a technique.
Well, I think the thing that struck me was there was no difference in the ways in which the predominantly Syrian refugees moved today from the way the people around them moved. And that's what I think I meant by saying, you know, the boundaries of Europe dissolve. Actually, when you look at it from that perspective, okay, there are some differences. Some people wear headscarves, some people don't. Some people take off their shoes in certain situations, and some people don't. It's not there's no difference. But there's immense amount of similarity. So it struck me as an interesting lens. And so one set of questions is about what separates or divides us from other people now, and is refugee the category that is operative there. And the other question is the historical question. We're in this land that is not only a land with an immense recorded history stretching back thousands of years, but in the recent past, in the last 100, 150 years, is a kind of laboratory for international refugee regimes, actually. The modern legal international refugee regime emerges out of Black Sea Balkan crises in the late 19th century. And so the second set of questions is about, well, you know, is the message here we're doomed to repeat the cycle of expulsion every few decades? Or is there some other way of thinking about the present's relationship to the past?
Constantly the same question, what did the camera reveal in terms of body movements? Is there, if one had to frame this in terms of displacement having its own body language, is that true? Can you say that?
Well, I think in Idomeni and in Platea Victoria, I mean, I think overall, in the universal picture, you know, the differences are kind of actually minimal, clearly. There are clearly differences in terms of the way a middle-class Syrian is different from, say, someone from Kabul or Jalalabad or Kandahar or whatever, or is different from someone from Dhaka. I mean, there are specific kind of cultural sort of differences. But I think what Mark was trying to say, and I think the film is trying to say, that in the end, in the final analysis, these are kind of quite minimal. You know, whether you squat on the ground and sit, and whether you leave your shoes outside the area that you've demarcated as your temporary home in the square, you know, which may be 2 meters by 2 meters, and you've put a blanket, and this is your living room. And all this, and I think the whole film, there's the bipolar thing in the film. There's the good guy is Maus, I think, no, to put it very crudely. The bad guy is the Nazi kind of constitutional lawyer, Schmidt. So this is the polarity within the film. You know, it's either about inclusion and exclusion. You know, and who are you with in the end? Are you with Abraham, or are you with someone who does not give hospitality? And I think the great thing about the film is that although it tries not to be sensationalist and it tries not to be emotional, I think it elicits undoubtedly a kind of an emotional response from the viewer. The elliptical quality of it and the absence of sensationalism, I think, is what elicits the emotional response in any viewer, I think. And I think this is what I consider one of the great successes of it.
And the interesting thing to me is that, I mean, one of the things that people talked this morning in an earlier panel about the refugee crisis is the fact that refugees have no voice. And what it became evident to me when I visited refugees camps in the island of Lesbos is they had no voice, but emotion and intimacy was communicated through movement and body language. And it was very obvious. You could tell immediately the emotional state of certain people right after they had come out of the water by the way they moved around. Men and women moved differently, children moved differently, and that was even more evident through the film. Because these people have no voice, they have no voice in the film. So you can tell that, you know, gestures communicate their emotional state, and there also is the way that they become intimate with someone who is looking at them.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that's a new experience, I mean, not having made a film before, is the experience of you know, I wouldn't want to say that I'm sure about what the film is about, really, and that's one of the pleasures of it for me. There are certain shots where I see quite different things each time that I hadn't noticed before. So I have my own view of what these things mean, but it's more about the act of interpreting movement, I think, than coming out with any particular. There was an underlying impulse, I think, from both of us, but it might not be shared by other people who see the actual imagery.
I don't actually think it's a film about the refugee. I think it's really a film about us, and it's about fear. You know, the fear that Europe has, and the fear that probably lurks in the heart of everybody, that one's life and one's can, from one moment to the next, be actually overturned. And I think this is the kind of the quite poignant, if you like, for me, subtext within underlying the whole film. The eftrafstotita, the fragility, if you like, of our existence. And I think this is compounded and reinforced by the images of 22, which you know, I'm very glad that Mark insisted that we make it very kind of, in a sense, Greek, but in a way it's Greek, but it's also kind of quite universal. And, you know, and these are images which are very, very poignant and very relevant, I think, to any Greek viewer, because, you know, they're things that you've grown up with and from passed on from generation to generation. And I think that notion of fragility is quite prevalent and quite powerful within this culture, whatever. So I think for me, it's about us rather than about, you know, the refugee as an object or as a subject or whatever. It's beyond that, I think.
It was of great interest to me to see the comparison between the photograph of the priest and then the archival footage, and it's obviously not staged, you can tell that, but the body gestures and the body language of both the priest and the woman, actually, I assume his wife sitting next to him, are very similar.
Well, yes, very similar and completely exhausted. And no, I remember very well being struck by, I mean, this coincidence that I had helped bring those photographs to the university, so I remembered the photographs, and then to see this. Something else perhaps to be said about the use of historical imagery. We very deliberately mixed it up chronologically. I mean, you start with an aeroplane. Well, you know, that was not from 1922. Then you cut to 22. So there was an effort here not to give the narrative. I think very deliberate effort to give you the historical sense in something closer to the sense in which we have a historical sense, which is jumbled and overlaid, and it's there, but you're not quite sure how it fits. The crowds running into the Bank of Greece. Well, you know it's the Bank of Greece because of the footage of the last few years, but when exactly? Why are they doing that? It's obviously another financial panic. So there was this, you know, ability that you have in a film that you don't have when you're writing a book, to play with memory in that kind of way.
Do you plan to continue doing similar work, Constantin? Do you think yourself doing kind of an archaeology of gestures?
Not just archaeology of gestures. I think what was interesting is we both have a very similar taste in terms of music. I mean, Mark actually introduced me to Andoni Dagla, who I didn't know actually, but I'm proud that I introduced him to Steve Reich and Hari Prasad Chaurasia, the Indian musician that he. So there was a kind of, we seem to have very similar admiration for as well Chris Marker, the French filmmaker, who does these elliptical, almost epistle-like documentaries in inverted commas. I think that would be kind of confining his genre, but very influenced by. And I was very pleased to be able to do this film with Mark. And yes, there are several possible projects in this vein, which could work as a gallery piece. It could work as something in a theater screen, and it could also work on television, I think. Yeah.
I would like to open the discussion for the audience to ask questions, please. Robert?
So I think you just brought this up. I was going to ask you to say something about the soundtrack. And I'm a layperson in this field. I'm sure it was thoughtful, and I'd like to understand a bit about where the thoughts were.
Sure. Do you want to say something, Sean? Soundtrack.
The soundtrack. Mark's original thing was that he wanted very much to use the Dagla piece with the amane, what we call in Greece the amane. It's a form of lamentful kind of Hamanaman, that's where it comes from. And it's he's a very famous singer who comes from, I found out because of Mark, he's very famous from Smyrna, who died during the occupation here in Greece in 1941, I think. I liked the repetitive or seemingly unemotional essence in Reich, who's one of the great American minimalists. You know, Glass, all these people come after him. But the fantastic thing that his minimalism and his the elliptical quality of the music actually elicits in me always a kind of an emotional response. And I've used him in a previous film I've done about Cavafy many years ago. So, and then Chaurasia is an Indian master who I'd come across when I was living in London over 25 years ago, and I'd lost the CD, and I'd lost his name, and I'd lost the CD, and I'd lost everything. And then, fortuitously, during the editing, a friend of mine from London said, "Oh, you must listen to this guy." And suddenly I rediscovered Chaurasia after 25 years, and Mark wanted a kind of an Eastern thing to it as well, and it seemed to be really, there's something quite archaic almost about Chaurasia, and it fitted beautifully, I think, in the end. And Mark had the quite brilliant idea of bringing the Platea Victoria material together with the piece, with the quotation, one of the few surviving fragments from Statios's work, the 1st century AD Roman poet. So it's just, filmmaking is about accident, I think, no? And things coming together,
Alan?
There's that wonderful picture of the person exiting the train and the boy searching the back of his backpack to make sure maybe nothing was taken.
Yes.
Were there many scenes like that you saw?
You see a lot of things in filming, and just what I said about the magic of sometimes filming. You go out and you observe quietly, and things happen in front of the lens which are completely inexplicable, which you only subsequently, when you go back and re-look at the material, you suddenly pick, look at this, I didn't, look what my lens is kind of fished out today. The other one, the great moment I think in the thing, is in Piraeus, in the harbor, where you have these two boys, and one of them is kind of trying to hit the other one, and then this strange wagon with the Greek flag goes by, and you think, well, I couldn't have even staged that. I couldn't have choreographed that if I tried, but it it's kind of one of these wonderful moments that happen in, which I suppose is similar to the wonderful moments that happen when you write, you know, and one thought, one word leads to another, and yes, a lot of stuff.
Robin?
Mark, if I could take you outside the film for a second and ask you to think as a historian as well for a moment. You said at the beginning of the film, history is the movement of people, and in many cases is how they've been welcomed into cities and urban sites. But the movement of people has also been about conquest, and the United States is an example of a way of the conquest of a land by another people. How do you interpret this increasing sense of insecurity around the movement of people, even in a country that's been as welcoming to immigrants as the United States has been? Is there something different about the world now, a world of 8 or 9 billion, where people fear the loss of space and seem to fear migration? You think of it totally differently to the way it was described in some moments of your film.
So you mean, and you're talking particularly about the US now, is there some reason for this sort of rise of insecurity? Well, you know, one obvious answer, which is a true one, is that, you know, the terrific downside to globalization has impacted middle class expectations, and now we're seeing the results in the US and elsewhere. But another answer would be one that is explored in the film, which is that it's actually, that just leads you to think about what is the nature of our expectations. And I was thinking about the difference between a world that we have today, where the horizon of expectation is essentially linear. And, you know, if you don't have GNP growth, something is wrong. I mean, that is the way an expectation is defined. And the way expectation was defined over centuries in most cultures of very different kinds, which was essentially cyclical. And that's then an interesting thing to think about. Well, if you have a cyclical notion of fate and destiny, then what does that do to your notion of hospitality? And so there's some meat there to think about whether our notion of GNP growth in fact makes us more obsessed with the fragility of what we have than in Abraham's time, to put it crudely.
Isn't also one of the things in the film the idea that war is the mother of Constanine?
Yeah.
Because the film starts with
yes.
the image of war, and it ends with the image of the retreating Greek army from the city, no?
Yes, yes.
So this cyclical sort of...
Is war a part of your life? Is war a part of the world's life in which therefore you deal with the war's consequences? Or is war something that you try to pretend does not happen, and therefore you live in a world which doesn't even want to call things wars that are in fact wars, because war is now something to be excluded? I remember feeling that very sharply was the prevailing attitude in Europe in the time of the Yugoslav wars in the 1990s. It was a conflict, and it was a conflict that wasn't really anything to do with us. And the us, as I said in the film, could be a matter of being in Split on the Croatian coast as opposed to being in Sarajevo, which was a 15-minute plane ride away.
Any other questions? Thank you again.
Thank you.